What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at some of the buggiest games I have reviewed, as I am currently in the middle of playing and trying to review a game called Of Ash and Steel, and it has certainly proven to be a buggy experience. In fact, I basically stopped to record this because I finally encountered a game-breaking bug, which, if not patched soon, is going to be a bit of a showstopper. And that, of course, got me thinking about the other bug titles I've played and reviewed over the years, and I thought, why not make a video about that? So, as you would probably imagine to some degree, I suppose, when you review games for a living, what I have to deal with in terms of buggy games and what the consumer should have to deal with are two very different things. In fact, for most people, if you play a game that has a lot of bugs, you may well put it down because it's a bad experience, and that's kind of the end of it. However, when you are reviewing said game, that is not the end of it unless the game is literally unplayable as far as I am concerned. And while yes, obviously it being buggy will certainly be a part of any review that happens from that point, sure, it's simply not enough to say that it was buggy and you stop. I think if you take your job seriously, you really need to push either through the bugs to see if there's anything beyond them, or if any of it actually outright breaks the game in some way, versus just being annoying. And so my tolerance for bugs is pretty high. Realistically, the only thing that's going to stop me from playing are games that, like I experienced with Of Ash and Steel recently, have something that is just straight up blocking the main story entirely. But then there's the flip side of it. A lot of games release fairly buggy. Obviously, whatever QA they did not being comparable to potentially millions of people playing something. And thus, even if everything goes perfectly, there's bound to be some things there that catch everybody by surprise. However, what tends to happen after that, if you're lucky and the game doesn't, completely die a horrible death, it will often get patches that fix things up, address the most serious problems, stuff like that. And even if that includes innocuous things that most people didn't notice, or just, again, the wealth of data from the release allowed them to notice and fix. And so not every buggy game stays a buggy game, and as a result, you're going to hear me talk a little bit about that as we go. But with no further ado, let's go ahead and dive into it and start talking about these things. So one of the ones that I wanted to mention straight away, because it is a game that is incredibly broken, is actually the Waylanders. A sort of a CRPG type of game that was trying to take a ton of inspiration from Dragon Age Origins in particular. A lot of people, myself included, were pretty excited for that one. And unfortunately, it's a game that launched incredibly broken. You could get through, I would say, roughly half or so of the game without too much of a fuss, outside of a couple of potential issues where some invisible walls might pop up and prevent some main stories from being completed. However, you could work around those and get through it before you start encountering major problems in the back half, where the game would just fall apart and become unplayable, with almost every other quest being something you could not complete. Now, thankfully, with the passage of time, and one or two random people being surprisingly dedicated to seeing it through, I do know that outside of the main story technically being completable, which I already knew, they were able to map out which side quests could or could not be worked around, things like that. And so it's technically a game you could complete if you were really trying hard enough. It would be a miserable experience with, again, just constant quest breaks, invisible walls popping up, leaving you unable to move forward, things breaking. It's a game that is in an absolutely busted state and is going to stay that way because shortly after its release, when it flopped as a result of all of this stuff, they abandoned the project entirely. This stuff is broken. It will never be fixed. Do be aware of that. Next up on our list, let's talk a little bit about Owlcat Games. So, if you follow the channel much at all, I really enjoy Owlcat Games' work. They make a ton of fantastic CRPGs, most recently with Rogue Trader, which has done so well that it's getting a second round of DLC in 2026. And chances are, if you're watching this video from me, you likely know that I cover almost everything they do at this point because I like their games so much. And yet, it simply must be stated that they've all been pretty buggy, especially on release in particular. However, the one specifically that I want to talk about is actually Kingmaker, because not only is it the game that they released the most busted, though with it being the studio's first big outing, that's not terribly surprising in and of itself, it actually gets a little stranger because as some people may or may not be aware, Owlcat Games does not own the rights to Kingmaker anymore. They've been trying to get them back, but they don't own it, technically speaking, and that is actually why Kingmaker did not receive nearly the same amount of post-launch support that Wrath of the Righteous or Rogue Trader has been receiving. So not only was there a bit of a learning curve with their first outing, they also just weren't able to patch it up and fix it, although just from the launch support that it did get, mind you, it's not completely unplayable over on PC. There are, to this day, a number of problems that can pop up. A lot of it is just in rougher shape than Wrath of the Righteous, thanks to less polish on the mechanics and things they fixed just over time. That came to Wrath of the Righteous as an example, but quest breaks, sequence breaks, bugs that leave you unable to progress, all that stuff is definitely things you can run into in Kingmaker. Even today, on release, those things were extremely common, especially in the later acts of the game, which thanks to the game's size didn't exactly get nearly as much testing as everywhere else did. And so while I love Pathfinder, Kingmaker is a bit of a hard sell, especially if you're on consoles where it's even worse, because of the problems you are likely to run into even these days. But speaking of games not running particularly well, next up we've got Fallout New Vegas. So New Vegas is a game that's a little notorious for its bugginess. It's a fantastic game in spite of all of those things, and I think it's definitely worth playing, and ironically it's the kind of game that I think modern machines have actually helped out, if anything, because the constant crashes you're likely to experience while playing it are mitigated by the fact that most computers today can load it in about 0.2 seconds. But as I imagine a lot of people are about to find out, with the Fallout Season 2 show coming up and, there being a game set around New Vegas where that Season 2 is taking place, of course, I imagine at least a few people will pick it up for the first time, only to be met with what can be only described as a erratic game. Now, there are mods that can help you with this. I am well aware before somebody tells me about it in the comments. However, I will say that personally speaking, I have never found a set of mods that was just the one true solution that didn't still leave you with problems. Simply put, New Vegas is, I would primarily describe it as an unstable experience. It's not so much that you're going to run into progress blockers, things like that. It's mostly just that the game is going to crash on you a lot, more than likely. And this can lead to other visual bugs and things that happen right before the game crashes on you, as an example, which is a less than ideal playing experience, even if that experience is worth it overall, I think. But as is also well documented, none of this is a surprise exactly, given that Fallout New Vegas was developed in a very short time frame that left Obsidian unable to deal with some of the bigger problems the game had in terms of that stability, which definitely led to the game's initially harsher reviews before, people kind of really got into it and saw just how great it could be if you were willing to work past those things. But I mean, even today, people are still clamoring for a remake or a remaster that cleans it up and basically turns it into a more playable experience without some of those issues. But we will certainly see what happens. Now, coming in at number 4 here, the next game I wanted to talk about is actually Redfall, a game I would say a fair few people have already left in the dust, given that Redfall's main claim to fame is that it was pretty broken upon release, actually. Now, like a great many other people, this is a game I reviewed when it released, and mentioned those things in said review, actually, but I did follow up on Redfall, made a couple of videos about the patches and things they did, the final update, where it landed, that kind of stuff. And these days, Redfall is a perfectly okay experience. They obviously didn't do enough patches thanks to the game's reception to make it some incredible experience or anything, but they did do enough work on it to make it, again, a solid enough experience for the right price, that is to say cheap. But it's certainly never going to be great, as it had all sorts of animation problems, quest blockers, things like that. Yes, however, probably in this case of this game, one of the bigger problems it had was actually the game's AI system. It was just kind of messed up. It had a really hard time getting to the player, meaning that even if you weren't particularly good at these kinds of games, it was just really easy to just put a little bit of space or an object in between you and an enemy, and it would just completely mess up up what they were trying to do. So you combine enemies that could just get really jacked up and be no threat in a game where, they're supposed to be putting some pressure on you, which would make things like the events and things that centered around that lack a lot of impact. But there were also bugs on the player's end, where like certain mechanics for individual characters you might be playing would just straight up not work, or they would get lost and stop working, things like that. And while Redfall eventually got to a place where it was, again, an okay experience, it was unfortunately too little too late with all the game's launch problems, leaving it an incredibly underwhelming experience that also didn't really deliver on the promise of like the play your way style that they were shooting for. Which was a shame because I think Redfall is a game with a neat premise that, again, it just fails to ever really deliver on, thanks in large part to the very poor presentation that all the problems with this game's bugs highlighted. And yet there is one final game I want to talk about, and that is none other than Stalker 2, actually. So Stalker 2 is another game that, with time and a lot of effort, has gotten a lot better than it was on its launch day. In particular, just very recently actually, like less than 2 weeks ago, they put out update 1.7, which added things like a new difficulty level, improvements to the A-Life system or the AI system that controls all the NPCs. But that is actually one of the key things I want to talk about, that A-Life system. That is a primary system for this game that drives most of what the NPCs are doing while you're out exploring and everything else. That, upon release, just straight up did not work. They had to turn it off because it was not working. And the thing is, even with it turned off and not working, there were still bugs galore. A lot of visual stuff, characters like spawning in wrong, half in the ground or other objects, things like that, missing limbs in some cases. And that's before you even start talking about, like things like performance, things like that. But to give a couple examples of some bugs, even back when I played it, when the game was about to release and everything, I would run into problems where like certain quests had to be completed a certain way specifically, or they would bug out and become something you could not complete. Some stuff like that you could fix by like reloading older saves and approaching them differently, which was a solution for a lot of the progress blocking stuff that could pop up. But unfortunately, just with the sheer volume of that stuff happening, the fact that the main sort of A-Life system wasn't in there, unfortunately Stalker 2 was definitely a very buggy release that has gotten a lot better since, thanks to the updates and patches and things they have put out. For starters, the A-Life system is up and working now, as an example. But this is certainly another case of bugs marring an otherwise really remarkable experience, because Stalker 2, I think, is a really great game if you can actually get in there and play it, which should be easier to do these days, but at the time of its release was hard for people to get past because of the variety of issues you could run into. Which is obviously what it's doing on this list. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear about some games that you played that were either like comically buggy, funny things happening, or to flip the script a little bit, if you've played any games that were remarkably smooth experiences, I'd love to hear about those as well. But be they the smallest of glitches or game-breaking fiascos, bugs are something that the industry has pretty much always dealt with and will likely continue to, despite best efforts to mitigate them, of course. But it's certainly not going to prevent me from continuing to try to review these games, so at the very least, I can tell you about these things when they happen. For today, though, that's pretty much going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. By all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.